Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Joe Wallis, CEO of Regulus, a U.S.-based defense company. Mr. Wallis, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Now, there are many things I'd like to talk to you about, but let's start with the most pressing. With the war in Ukraine in its third year, and rising tensions globally, how do you assess Europe's current defense industrial capacity, and what critical weaknesses need urgent attention?
I'll say that Europe's defense capacity just honestly wasn't built for a conflict like the one we're seeing in Ukraine right now. Russia is firing 27,000 artillery rounds per day. And Ukraine, I think, is managing about 5,000. So, and then you add to that, Russia is producing about 3 million shells annually, which, if you think about that, works out to about 12,000 shells per day. And Europe, honestly, is just struggling to keep pace. The critical weakness that I see is the production lines across the continent are just not set up to scale quickly. The biggest opportunity, I believe, is to build a new capacity in places with skilled labor and existing infrastructure. And to be frank, that's exactly why we're investing in Bosnia. We see the chance to build something that serves both the European defense needs and also builds, and helps economic growth in Bosnia.
Right. We'll be speaking much more in much more detail about Bosnia in a while, but let's look at the European picture a bit more from a different perspective. So the thing is, during the last years of the Cold War, Europe had significant militaries. They had a lot of a very well-developed industrial arms complex. What happened after the end of the Cold War? Why have we reached the stage, not only Europe, but the United States as well, the stage right now where Europe cannot produce enough artillery shells to supply the Ukrainians or even for its own needs?
It's interesting. We're seeing something in modern warfare that we haven't seen in a long time, is that artillery is back at the center of that, right? And with Russia producing so many rounds and firing thousands of rounds per day, that puts a pretty enormous pressure on the Western stockpiles. And it also exposes some real vulnerabilities in the supply chain.
The United States spends far more on defense than all EU states combined. So can Europe, ever close that gap, or should we just focus on, niche capabilities?
I'm going to be honest. I don't believe that Europe should try to mirror the U.S. defense spending. Honestly, I believe, just in my opinion, it should focus on targeted capabilities that ensure that every nation state has the ability to defend themselves. And that's kind of why we're making our investment into Bosnia, right? Which we can make a huge difference in that economic capacity for Bosnia's own security. After all, economic security is national security. And right now, artillery production, as I see it, is one of the most urgent needs. Russia, they've just ramped up production to more than 3 million shells a year. And that's what a wartime economy at full throttle looks like. And also, this is where I believe that private investment becomes absolutely essential. Governments alone just cannot move fast enough, but companies like Regulus can invest directly in the production capability. In Bosnia, we're putting that capital to work where it matters. We want to produce artillery rounds that can help NATO and its allies, and at the same time, kind of create jobs in the local economy.
Yeah, that was exactly my next question. So, amid Europe's defense expansion, why did Regulus choose to invest in Bosnia's aging defense sector, and what unique assets or strategic advantages does Bosnia and the wider Western Balkans have to offer? We know that before the war, during the communist period, Yugoslavia had a pretty well-developed arms industry. This, of course, fell into ruins after the collapse of Yugoslavia, but things have been picking up slowly over the last couple of years.
I'm going to tell you that Bosnia has some real potential. If you go back to the era of the Cold War, in former Yugoslavia, that was the crown jewel of Soviet production. That was 1 million rounds of capacity that was being produced in the area. And like I said, Bosnia has all the potential in the world. What it has is a skilled workforce. It has the existing infrastructure, and it's in a strategic location in Europe. And for us, Bosnia stands out.
So Bosnia has legacy arms factories, but lacks modernization. We know that before the war, Yugoslavia had some of the most developed arms and defense capabilities in Eastern Europe. So now, what do you, as Regulus, plan to do to modernize Bosnia's defense capabilities and its factories?
So I think that number one, I think that Bosnia is kind of already on that path to a certain degree. And what, like you talked about, the modernization is what we need. And that's really truly it's the integration with the EU and NATO procurement systems, a clear regulatory framework. And that's where companies like Regulus come in. We want to invest in the tools, technology and the training that's needed to meet those modern standards. And Bosnia can absolutely compete after that. It can compete in the defense market. And I think that Bosnia is going to be a key part of Europe's defense future.
Yeah, what's interesting, over the last 5 to 10 years, I've noticed some major American companies such as BlackRock, KKR, and of course now Regulus, making significant investments in the Balkan region. I mean, why is the Balkans interesting at this point? Why is private capital flooding into this market now? I mean, what's interesting is that back in the 1990s, when communism first collapsed, we had big companies like ArcelorMittal or Glencore investing in East European metal industries. But now we see these big American companies investing into the Bosnian defense sector, real estate, critical infrastructure, and so on and so forth.
Right. The Balkans, again, just has really great potential with the skilled workforce and that existing infrastructure. And most importantly, it's at a strategic location in Europe. For us, at Regulus, Bosnia stands out because it has that strong tradition of manufacturing and the population is ready to work. I've met people of Bosnia and they're amazing. And I think that together we can build something that's very significant. For us, we're not just investing in the factories. We're investing in long-term partnerships. We want to create jobs. We want to grow the economy, and we want to help Bosnia reestablish itself as a very serious player in the European industry. And that's why, honestly, that's why private capital is moving here, because there's a shared sense of purpose in that.
Right. Joe, it was such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.